Hello everybody and welcome along to today's video where I thought, as it's the end of the Peter Capaldi era, I thought over the next few weeks I'd count down every single episode of the 12th Doctor, ranking them from number 40 to number 1. And starting with today, I was going to do the first 10 of them. It's going to be 4 videos over the next 4 weeks. Check my channel every Saturday over the next 4 weeks to see the next 10 of Peter Capaldi's best and worst episodes. Today, of course, we've got to start at the bottom, so we are starting with essentially Peter Capaldi's worst episodes. So let's get straight into it with number 40. So in at number 40, and what I'm sure won't be a surprise to many people in being essentially the worst episode of the Peter Capaldi era, it is Sleep No More. So yes, Sleep No More is... I did like that they tried to do something different with this story. It was nice to be experimental and just trying a different style of storytelling with the found footage element to it and everything. But for me, it just really didn't work as a concept. Unfortunately, it sort of wasn't realised at all well. It was very hard to follow what was going on. The plot didn't really make any sense. I know that was some of the idea, it wasn't meant to make any sense. But for me, it was just a really difficult episode to follow, and I didn't really find anything enjoyable about it when watching it, sort of even several times afterwards. It's almost, I don't want to say a boring episode, but it's just a very sort of hard to enjoy, hard to find particularly interesting story, even if they are doing something a little bit different with it. So for me, unfortunately, I have to put this right at the very bottom of the Peter Capaldi era, simply because I just don't like this story, really. The ending's confusing, and as much as it's meant to not really make any sense, it just doesn't. And most of this story doesn't make any sense. A lot of supporting characters aren't very good, other than Reece Shearsmith's character in that episode, and it just doesn't entice me at all, really. So unfortunately, it's at number 40. But of course, let's move on to number 39. Now, number 39, I'm sure, will also not surprise pretty much anybody. It is In the Forest of the Night. So yes, this episode, unfortunately, has got to come right down near the bottom as well. It's generally probably ranked by everybody as pretty much the worst episode of the Capaldi era, because the visuals are very impressive, but that's about it. I have done a video on this in the past where I asked whether it's really that bad, and I said it isn't terrible, but it is still one of the worst episodes of the Capaldi era, unfortunately. The plot is just terrible. These whole magical alien stuff, or whatever we don't even know what it is, that's been here since before time and apparently is saving the Earth. There wasn't any evil plot in reality, they were just protecting the Earth. It was just a bit confusing, it didn't really make any sense whatsoever, and the plot line about this girl's sister, Maeve's sister I think it is, who suddenly turns up from behind a bush at the end of the episode, is just offensive. It's just such an utterly terrible cliched plot device. To have this sort of missing girl who suddenly turns up from behind a magical bush at the end of the episode. Honestly, that is a key part of why I put this so low, because this almost annoys me. Very rarely does Doctor Who actually annoy me, but that moment is just so utterly terrible, it annoys me. So therefore, it's down at number 39. So we've done a Series 9 and a Series 8 episode, might as well do a Series 10 episode down at the bottom now. At number 38, it's The Eaters of Light, which I was a little bit disappointed about, because I was really hoping that Rona Munro would do a good job of it. Of course, she'd written for Classic Who, she'd written Survival, which was a good story, and I enjoyed that one, so I had optimism and hopes that this would be a good story. It had a great title, The Eaters of Light. It's such a cool Doctor Who-esque title for a story. But the episode just wasn't very good. I just didn't really find anything particularly interesting about it. It was just your sort of reasonably generic monster creature there, and it just wasn't much of an exciting plot. I mean, I have no interest in that period of history, to be honest, so maybe that pulled me out the episode a little bit as well. But it was just a sort of... It felt very, very bog-standard Doctor Who, which is unfortunate. And coming in just before the finale, again, it kind of gets forgotten. I mean, all 3 of these episodes have actually been the episode before the start of the multi-part finale of each Capaldi series. So clearly that last episode just isn't generally very good. It's just sort of the one that gets shifted towards the end of the series before the finales, almost so maybe people forget about them. Because this one, yeah, again, the visuals are very good in The Eaters of Light. I do like that sort of Scottish setting. But I just don't really find it very enjoyable or fun, and it being essentially the last standalone Peter Capaldi episode as well, it's just really disappointing, and to have it from Rona Munro, unfortunately it's just not an episode for me. So coming at number 37, we have The Woman Who Lived, which is the sort of second part of the mid-series A Shilda two-parter of Series 9, which unfortunately for me just doesn't really work that well. I know what it's trying to do. It's meant to be a character study of Ashilda, or me, or whatever you want to stupidly call her, about her becoming immortal and how you cope with that and what it's like having to live on this earth for years and years and years. And that part of the episode is nice. It's not that exciting. And it feels like a lot of the territory we've covered before with Jack, whether it be in Torchwood or in Doctor Who. So it felt like a bit of retreading the same ground. The actual plot in this episode was a complete waste of time. I've been talked about this before. Lenny the Lion from Leonia or something ridiculous like that. It's literally the most stereotypical. He's a lion alien that's just so generic and pointless. And almost maybe this episode would have worked better without a plot at all, and it was just about the character study to who Ishilda has become when she's become immortal. But the actual plot they put in was rubbish and was clearly just there because they needed to have some sort of little alien thing to please the kids, because otherwise this would have, let's be honest, very, very, very little interest to a younger audience, because it's just not a very exciting episode. So as much as it's reasonable what it does, I just don't really find it that exciting, and it is definitely one of the weaker episodes of the Capaldi era. I think it also suffers from coming straight after The Girl Who Died, so there's no feeling of a passage of time, where we haven't seen Ishilda and she's grown older and lived out these hundreds of years, so we're expected to sort of go from one episode to straight away the next one has suddenly been hundreds and hundreds of years for her, and she's tired of being immortal and all this kind of thing. And it just is a bit harder to sort of believe and understand when they're back to back. They should have had a big gap in the series, and maybe should have had The Girl Who Died in episode 1 or 2, and The Woman Who Lived a sort of 7 or 8, just to have that sort of passage of time and it really feel, and you can really understand this. Yes, it really has been a long time for her, where it just, I don't think works in this episode, unfortunately. So that's why it's really low again as well. Coming in at number 36, we've got Series 8's The Caretaker, which is a reasonably entertaining episode. I will certainly give it that. I do like that they went for doing a sort of rom-com in Doctor Who, which isn't really done very often, I think it's fair to say. It's one of the sort of least used, I guess, genre styles for a Doctor Who episode. But it did what it was meant to quite well, and it did sort of give a little bit more depth to the relationship between Clara and Danny back in the middle of Series 8. But I just found a lot of it was a little bit cringy, some of the jokes weren't very funny, and it was all just a little bit awkward, I thought, at times. And I sort of felt the treatment of the Doctor also wasn't very good in this episode. Personally, for me, I've seen criticism of my thoughts on this before, but I don't really like Danny's attitude towards the Doctor. I can kind of understand it, but I just don't, it just doesn't sit right with me, and it really kind of annoys me about this episode a little bit. So unfortunately it sort of pushes it quite far down, and then the plot itself just is your generic killer robot dude, which looked really spectacular and could have been a really good idea, but they really underused it in this story and just sort of left it to the side and focused on the relationship between Clara and Danny, I think. So overall it therefore just pushes it right down towards the bottom. Number 35 is Smile from early Series 10, which was a story that just was a little bit uninspiring for me. I quite like the sort of earlier elements when it is basically just the Doctor and Bill together for a good 20 minutes. It was a nice way of developing the relationship and sort of building up the chemistry between the two characters, and I liked that part of it. But the plot itself was very lacking. The visuals were amazing, but the plot wasn't there, and it was a proper Deus Ex Machina ending that it just sort of, the Doctor magically said a few words and suddenly the whole place blew up, but it actually didn't, and everything was resolved. It just was, after a fair amount of build-up, which was quite good. It wasn't too bad. It was reasonably interesting and quite, you were wondering exactly how they're going to get out of this. And then suddenly, bang, 10 seconds later, boom, it's all over, it's fine again. Just is not the way to end an episode. You always want to have a little bit more of an interesting resolution to a story. So unfortunately, that's why this one pushes it quite far down as well. Coming in at number 34, it is Kill the Moon, which has probably been one of the most sort of divisive and highly debated episodes of the Peter Capaldi era. And unfortunately for me, I also do rate it quite lowly down towards the bottom of the Capaldi episodes. Mainly because of two things. First is the Moon is an Egg plot, which just, I haven't always been massively against it, but it just really isn't a very good idea, and we like to have some scientific plausibility in Doctor Who, which this just isn't at all. It's just complete fantasy, which although Doctor Who at times is, I just feel there should be usually some sort of scientific element to it. So I just find it a bit too much of a stretch to sort of accept the Moon is an Egg as an idea in this episode. And the other thing that really annoys me about this episode is the characterisation of the Doctor, who is, for me personally, completely out of character in this episode. He wouldn't just run off when the humans need the help the most, when the Doctor's companion Clara needs her help the most, why would he just suddenly disappear for 20 minutes and leave them to it because he needs to sort of let them make their own decisions and that kind of thing? It just didn't sit right with me at all. It really felt, and I agree with Clara that she should be properly angry at the Doctor, because that's not what the Doctor does. Yes, the Doctor was a little bit more harsh and dark and a little bit more difficult to get on with in Series 8, but that's still, even for Series 8 Capaldi, just felt out of character for me and really didn't sit right. So unfortunately, that means that's why I've had to push this one down so far, just because it's one of the few episodes that really does annoy me from the Capaldi era because of that. When I see these scenes towards the end of the episode when the 12th Doctor suddenly just like, you can make your own decisions, and walks off, and Clara gets really angry at him, I'm agreeing with her. I can see that. That's not the Doctor. That's not what he's like, for me personally. So that's why this has got to go so low in the rankings. So as we approach the last few episodes for this week's video, at number 33 we have the return of Dr. Mysterio, which, for me, I'm not a fan of superhero movies, so that probably is a significant reason for why it's knocked down for me, because I'm sure if you're a huge fan of superhero movies, it would have probably had a bit more appeal and a bit more enjoyable. But for me, it just didn't really have anything particularly interesting in it that worked for me and that I particularly enjoyed. It felt like a very bog standard Doctor. Yes, they did a superhero plot in it, but it still felt like a very bog standard Doctor Who episode with a generic alien invasion plot to it, and not that great resolution, and a little love story in it as well. It felt like sort of generic Doctor Who on Christmas Day to a large degree, so that had to push it down quite far for me. I did like the ending to this episode. It was those last few scenes when we see the Doctor's sort of little speech about being happy. They're really, really nice, and I really enjoy that. That's probably one of the highlights of the episode, is those last few minutes. But everything before it, as much as it's reasonably enjoyable, and watching it the last time I watched it, I did find it a little bit better than I had previously. It's just not for me. It's not my episode. Coming in at number 32, we have Time Heist, which I like. It is a reasonably good episode, but it just does what it says in the tin. It is just a bank robbery in space, but there's also a time element to it as well, which is a nice idea, and I do like it. Therefore, it's not that low down, but it very much is just what it says it is. It is your sort of mid-series Doctor Who story. Even if the actual concept is reasonably interesting, it's never going to be something particularly spectacular. I do like the visuals to it. I do like lots of the sort of interior shots of the bank. They're all very well realised. The Tell is a very, very impressive alien. And there's quite a few those other characters who I'm with the Doctor and Clara through this episode are quite good. I quite enjoy them, but as an episode, it's just your sort of bog standard Doctor Who's the best way of describing it. So it's never really going to rank much higher than 30 odd, I think, in these rankings. And so our final episode of this week, coming in at number 31, it is Knock Knock, which, again, kind of like Time Heist, it's okay. It's reasonable Doctor Who, but it just feels like something particularly unspectacular. For me personally, I don't particularly enjoy haunted house stories and all that kind of thing. I just don't really find them particularly interesting. They just don't do it for me as those sort of horror stories. So having that sort of element just being realised in Doctor Who doesn't really do a huge amount for me. That's why I kind of felt it just... I watched it and I was just thinking, this is okay. I can see it's doing well at what it's meant to be doing, which is creating a haunted house sort of story, a little horror-y element sort of story to it. But it's just not quite for me. It's not that spectacular. The villain wasn't really a villain in the story, and the resolution suddenly just blow up the building and boom, that's the end of it. So I didn't really enjoy that much of it. David Suchet was fantastic. I thought his performance was great in this episode, and certainly that's one of the highlights. And most of the sort of supporting cast of young adults, I guess you'd call them, who are friends of Bill, they're all pretty good in this, but the actual plot just doesn't really do anything for me, unfortunately, so that's why I have to put it down at number 31. But there we go, guys. That is my ranking of the bottom 10 Peter Capaldi episodes. I'd love to hear from you guys. What do you think are sort of some of the not so good? I don't really like saying the word worst, because I don't feel there's any episode in Doctor Who that's absolutely terrible. Certainly Sleep No More and In the Forest of the Night are pretty low, but I don't think they're completely the worst of the worst. So what are your least favourite episodes of the Capaldi era? I'd love to hear all your thoughts. And also what you think of my list. Do you agree with some of my thoughts, or are you like, why on earth have you rated that so low or so high? I'd love to hear from you. So remember, tune in this time next week, next Saturday at hopefully about 7 PM. I'll have the next 10 episodes counting down from number 30 to number 21. And then through the following couple of weeks, we'll get through the last 20 episodes to find out what is the very best, in my opinion, Peter Capaldi Doctor Who episode. But other than that, guys, remember to like this video, subscribe if you're new here, and I'll see you again very, very soon for another video. Goodbye.